Moji najbolji inženjeri nisu uspjeli. I ti misliš da možeš? Stari domar je popravio auto u Sarajevu. Winter wind cut through Sarajevo like a blade, carrying the metallic scent of old factories and fresh snow. In the industrial district of Rajlovac, where socialist-era buildings stood like monuments to a different time, the Bosna Motors workshop hummed with frustrated energy. The main garage, a converted warehouse with concrete floors and fluorescent lights, housed the company's latest challenge, a 1954 Volkswagen Käfer that had arrived from Germany 3 weeks ago. The classic car sat motionless under harsh workshop lights, its faded blue paint telling stories of decades past. Steam rose from coffee cups as mechanics gathered around the vehicle, their breath visible in the cold air. Outside, snow began to fall on the city's red-tiled roofs, and the distant sound of trams echoed through the valley. The workshop smelled of motor oil, metal shavings, and the strong Bosnian coffee that kept everyone awake during these long winter days. This was supposed to be their crowning achievement, a complete restoration for a collector in Mostar who had paid premium money for perfection. Adnan Kapic stood in his glass office overlooking the workshop floor, his tailored suit a sharp contrast to the grease-stained uniforms below. At 42, he carried himself with the confidence of a man who had built Bosna Motors from nothing into one of Sarajevo's most respected automotive restoration companies. His engineering degree from the University of Sarajevo hung prominently on the wall, alongside photos of completed projects and satisfied clients. Through the window, he watched his team of young engineers, the best graduates money could hire, struggle with the German classic. Their modern diagnostic equipment beeped and flashed, but the car remained silent. Adnan's jaw tightened as he checked his Rolex. The Mostar client was expecting updates, and all he had to offer were excuses. He had promised his team could handle any challenge, had boasted about their cutting-edge technology and superior education. Now, with each passing day, his reputation felt as fragile as thin ice on the Miljacka River. The pressure was mounting, and someone would have to answer for this failure. Before we continue with this incredible story, tell us, which country are you watching us from? Leave a comment and click the hype button or like so this video reaches even more people. Subscribe to the channel. You can't miss tomorrow's story. And now, let's continue. The engineering team huddled around the Volkswagen like doctors around a dying patient. Marco, the lead engineer, wiped sweat from his forehead despite the cold. His computer displayed error codes that made no sense, diagnostic readings that contradicted everything he had learned in university. "The electrical system is completely fried," he muttered to his colleague Amira, who was examining the transmission with growing frustration. "We've replaced half the wiring, but something keeps shorting out." The other engineers nodded grimly, their confidence eroded by weeks of failed attempts. They had tried everything: new spark plugs, rebuilt carburetor, modern electronic ignition systems carefully adapted to the vintage design. Each solution seemed to create new problems, as if the old car was rejecting their modern approach. The workshop had become a graveyard of discarded parts and broken theories. Outside, the snow continued to fall, and the pressure from upstairs grew heavier with each passing hour. The young engineers, once so sure of their abilities, now questioned everything they thought they knew about automotive repair. Hassan Jemal moved through the workshop like a ghost, his cleaning cart squeaking softly against the concrete floor. At 71, he had become part of the furniture, invisible to the young engineers who barely acknowledged his presence. His weathered hands guided a mop across oil stains, while his sharp eyes observed every detail of the struggling restoration project. 20 years as a janitor at Bosna Motors had taught him to work around the edges, to fix what others overlooked. A loose door handle here, a flickering light there, small problems that kept the business running smoothly. He wore the same blue coveralls every day, patched in several places, but always clean. His grey beard was neatly trimmed, and his eyes held the quiet wisdom of someone who had seen both war and peace. The engineers treated him politely but distantly, like a piece of helpful equipment rather than a human being. They had no idea that behind his humble appearance lay decades of experience with the exact type of car that now defied their modern expertise. The workshop erupted in a crescendo of mechanical sounds as another attempt failed spectacularly. Sparks flew from under the Volkswagen's hood, followed by a sharp pop and the acrid smell of burned electronics. Marco jumped back, cursing in 3 languages, while Amira quickly disconnected the battery. The expensive diagnostic equipment showed flatlined readings, and silence fell over the garage like a heavy blanket. It was then that Hassan approached, pushing his cart with deliberate slowness. In his weathered hands, he carried a small toolbox, not the modern electric tools the engineers used, but simple manual instruments that looked like museum pieces. His movement caught Marco's attention, and irritation flashed across the young engineer's face. "What does the old man want now?" he whispered to Amira, loud enough for Hassan to hear. The janitor stopped beside the car, studying it with the same intensity a scholar might examine an ancient manuscript. His presence somehow felt different than usual, more focused, more purposeful. Adnan's voice cut through the workshop air like a cold wind from the mountains. He had descended from his office, his expensive shoes clicking against the concrete as he surveyed the latest failure. His face showed the controlled anger of a man whose reputation was crumbling with each passing day. "This is unacceptable," he announced to the gathered team, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "We have the best equipment, the most qualified engineers, and yet we can't fix a car that's older than most of our fathers." His eyes swept across the workshop, taking in the scattered tools, the frustrated faces, and the silent Volkswagen that had become their shared nemesis. The young engineers shifted uncomfortably, knowing that their jobs might depend on solving this puzzle. Adnan's gaze lingered on each face, searching for answers that no one seemed able to provide. The pressure in the room was palpable, like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks over the Sarajevo valley. That's when Hassan stepped forward, his toolbox in hand. The movement was subtle but deliberate, like a chess player making a calculated move. He approached the car with the reverence of someone entering a sacred space, his eyes studying the engine compartment with an intensity that surprised everyone present. Adnan's attention snapped to the elderly janitor, and his expression shifted from frustration to incredulous anger. The audacity of this simple cleaning man, this nobody who spent his days mopping floors and emptying trash bins, approaching their sophisticated engineering problem as if he had something to contribute. The workshop fell silent except for the distant hum of heating units and the soft whistle of wind through gaps in the building. Even the young engineers stopped their conversations, sensing that something significant was about to happen. Hassan's presence suddenly felt larger than his humble appearance suggested, and the air itself seemed to hold its breath. Adnan's voice exploded across the workshop, with the force of suppressed frustration finally finding its target. "Moji, najbolji inženjeri nisu uspjeli, ti misliš da možeš." The words hit Hassan like physical blows, their meaning clear to everyone present. "My best engineers couldn't do it, and you think you can." The accusation hung in the air, heavy with class distinction and professional pride. Adnan's face reddened with the indignation of a man whose authority had been questioned by someone he considered beneath notice. The young engineers watched in uncomfortable silence, caught between loyalty to their boss and curiosity about what the old janitor might know. Hassan absorbed the insult without flinching, his weathered face showing neither anger nor hurt, just the quiet dignity of someone who had endured far worse than workplace humiliation. His grip on the toolbox remained steady, and his eyes never left the car that had defeated so many educated minds. The confrontation crystallized every social tension within the workshop: youth versus age, education versus experience, authority versus wisdom. The workshop atmosphere grew thick with tension as Adnan continued his verbal assault. 20 years you've been here, cleaning up after real professionals, and now you want to play mechanic." His voice carried the cutting edge of social superiority, each word designed to put Hassan back in his assigned place. The other workers shifted uncomfortably, some avoiding eye contact, while others watched with the fascination of spectators at a collision. Marco and Amira exchanged glances, uncertain whether to intervene or maintain their professional distance. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows that made every face look sharper, more defined. Outside, the winter wind rattled the windows, and snow continued to accumulate on the sills. Hassan stood motionless through the tirade, his expression unchanged, like a mountain weathering a storm. His silence seemed to irritate Adnan even more, as if the old man's refusal to respond was another form of insubordination. The Volkswagen sat between them like a silent judge, its mechanical problems suddenly seeming less important than the human drama unfolding around it. As Adnan's anger reached its peak, something shifted in the workshop's atmosphere. Hassan finally spoke, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of decades. Sometimes the old ways know what the new ways forgot. The words were simple, delivered without drama or confrontation, but they carried an authority that surprised everyone present. His accent held traces of a generation that had learned their craft when precision meant survival, when there were no diagnostic computers to rely on, only skill and instinct. The young engineers found themselves leaning forward unconsciously, as if sensing that this humble janitor might possess knowledge they had never encountered in their textbooks. Adnan's face darkened further at what he perceived as defiance, but something in Hassan's manner, a quiet confidence born of real experience, gave him pause. The old man's eyes held no challenge, no disrespect, only the calm certainty of someone who had solved problems like this before. The workshop fell into a silence, broken only by the soft sound of snow against the windows and the distant rumble of traffic on the streets of Sarajevo. The tension broke like ice cracking on the Neretva River when Hassan set down his toolbox with deliberate precision. The metallic clink echoed through the workshop, and every eye followed his movements as he approached the Volkswagen's open hood. His weathered hands hovered over the engine compartment without touching anything, like a surgeon planning an operation. The fluorescent lights cast sharp shadows across his lined face, highlighting decades of experience etched in every wrinkle. Adnan stood frozen, caught between outrage and curiosity, while the young engineers watched with the fascination of students witnessing something beyond their textbooks. Hassan's examination was methodical, his eyes tracing electrical connections and mechanical linkages with the intensity of someone reading a familiar language. The workshop had fallen so quiet that the sound of his breathing was audible, each exhale forming small clouds in the cold air. Outside, the snow continued its relentless fall, and the distant sound of a tram bell reminded everyone that the normal world continued beyond these walls. This moment felt suspended in time, balanced on the edge of discovery or disaster. Adnan's professional pride reasserted itself, like a defensive wall rising against invasion. "You don't even touch that engine," he commanded, his voice sharp enough to cut steel. "I won't have some janitor destroying weeks of careful work." He stepped closer to Hassan, using his height advantage to intimidate, his expensive cologne clashing with the workshop's mixture of oil and metal. The young engineers shifted nervously, sensing their boss's barely controlled fury, but also detecting something unusual in the old man's confident demeanor. Marco cleared his throat, ready to support his employer, but the words died in his mouth when he saw how Hassan moved around the car. There was nothing random or uncertain in the janitor's approach. Every gesture suggested deep familiarity with this type of vehicle. Amira found herself studying Hassan's face, noting the calm intelligence in his eyes that she had somehow missed during 20 years of casual encounters. The Volkswagen seemed to respond to his presence, as if recognizing an old friend after a long separation. Even the workshop's harsh lighting couldn't diminish the quiet authority that surrounded Hassan like an invisible force field. The standoff continued as Hassan calmly opened his toolbox, revealing instruments that belonged to a different era of automotive repair. His tools were manual, precise, and maintained with the care of a craftsman who understood that good equipment was an extension of skilled hands. Each wrench and screwdriver showed the polish of decades of use, their handles worn smooth by countless hours of honest work. Adnan's modern engineers used computerized diagnostic equipment that cost more than most people's cars, but something about Hassan's simple tools suggested a deeper understanding of mechanical principles. "These toys belonged in a museum 50 years ago," Adnan scoffed, but his voice carried less conviction than before. Hassan selected a wrench with the deliberation of a musician choosing the right instrument, testing its weight and balance before approaching the engine. The young engineers found themselves leaning forward unconsciously, drawn by the old man's quiet confidence, despite their boss's obvious disapproval. The workshop had become a battlefield where old wisdom faced new technology, and the outcome remained uncertain as the winter wind howled through the Sarajevo streets outside. Without asking permission, Hassan began his examination in earnest. His fingers traced electrical connections with the gentle touch of someone reading Braille, feeling for problems that sophisticated equipment had failed to detect. He murmured to himself in the local dialect, words that sounded like incantations to the watching engineers. "Polako ali sigurno daleko dojesz. Slowly but surely, you reach far." Adnan's face reddened at this obvious defiance of his authority, but something in Hassan's methodical approach gave him pause. The old man's movements were too purposeful, too confident to dismiss entirely. Marco stepped closer, his engineering curiosity overcoming his loyalty to office hierarchy. "What are you looking for?" he asked quietly, earning a sharp glare from Adnan. Hassan paused in his examination, his weathered hands still touching the engine components. "Sometimes the problem isn't where the machine tells you to look," he said simply. "Sometimes you must listen with your hands, not your computer's." His voice carried the authority of someone who had learned automotive repair, when diagnosis meant understanding the language that engines spoke through sound and vibration. The workshop atmosphere shifted as Hassan continued his hands-on examination, ignoring the expensive diagnostic equipment that surrounded the Volkswagen like high-tech sentries. His approach was fundamentally different from anything the young engineers had witnessed. Instead of relying on digital readouts and computer analysis, he used his senses in ways they had never been taught. He pressed his ear against different parts of the engine, listening for sounds that only experience could interpret. His fingers felt for vibrations, heat patterns, and subtle irregularities that no machine could detect. "This is prehistoric," Amira whispered to Marco, but her tone carried fascination rather than dismissal. Adnan paced behind them like a caged animal, torn between stopping this unauthorized inspection and watching to see what the old man might discover. The contrast was stark. Millions of dollars worth of modern equipment surrounding one elderly janitor with hand tools that predated the computer age. Yet something in Hassan's confident movements suggested that this primitive approach might succeed where technology had failed. The silence stretched taut as everyone waited to see whether wisdom or embarrassment would emerge from this unconventional diagnostic session. Minutes passed like hours as Hassan's examination grew more focused. He had identified something that made his movements more deliberate, more purposeful. Using a simple screwdriver, he began to remove a cover plate that none of the engineers had thought to check, a small access panel hidden beneath newer modifications that previous owners had added over the decades. Adnan watched with growing unease as the old man revealed components that their sophisticated scanning equipment had never detected. "You're contaminating the work area," he protested, but his voice lacked its earlier authority. Hassan's tools moved with surgical precision, each action serving a clear purpose that became apparent only in retrospect. The young engineers gathered closer, their initial skepticism replaced by professional curiosity. They had spent weeks assuming that the problem lay in the areas their equipment could analyze, but Hassan was exploring mechanical territories that their modern approach had overlooked entirely. The workshop filled with the sound of careful disassembly, each removed component revealing layers of automotive history that told the story of this car's long journey through different hands and different decades of repair attempts. What Hassan uncovered made the entire engineering team fall silent. Beneath the access panel lay a maze of improvised wiring that spoke of decades of quick fixes and temporary solutions. Someone, probably in the 1970s, had bypassed the original electrical system with modifications that looked professional at first glance, but revealed their inadequacy under closer inspection. The modern diagnostic equipment had been reading these false signals, chasing symptoms rather than identifying the core problem. Hassan traced the rogue wiring with his finger, following connections that led to dead ends and phantom circuits that confused every computer system the engineers had employed. "Tako drugome jamu kopa, samunyu pada," he murmured. "Who digs a hole for others falls into it himself." The original mechanic's attempt to simplify the electrical system had created a labyrinth that trapped every subsequent repair effort. Adnan stared at the revelation with growing amazement and mounting embarrassment. His expensive equipment, his educated engineers, his modern methodology, all had been defeated by wiring installed before any of them were born. The old janitor had identified in minutes what had eluded weeks of sophisticated analysis. The discovery transformed the workshop dynamic like sunrise breaking over the Sarajevo hills. Marco and Amira exchanged glances that mixed professional admiration with personal humility, while the other engineers gathered around Hassan's work area with the eagerness of students encountering a master craftsman. Even Adnan found himself drawn closer, his anger gradually giving way to reluctant fascination. Hassan continued his methodical dismantling, revealing more evidence of the car's complex repair history. Each removed component told a story: hasty fixes from the 1980s, quality restoration work from the 1990s, and recent attempts that had actually made the problem worse by adding modern solutions to vintage problems. The workshop filled with the quiet sounds of careful craftsmanship, the precise click of tools engaging, the whisper of components being set aside, the soft commentary that Hassan provided as he worked. His hands moved with the confidence of someone who had spent decades solving exactly these types of mysteries, and his calm demeanor suggested that this complexity, far from overwhelming him, was exactly what he had expected to find in a car of this age and history. A small pause in story. I want to ask you, what do you think about this? Write in the comments. Don't forget to click the hype or like button so this story reaches more people, and subscribe to the channel because tomorrow a new story awaits you. And now we continue. As word of Hassan's discovery spread through the workshop, other mechanics began to gather around the Volkswagen like villagers drawn to a storyteller's fire. The old man's reputation was transforming before their eyes. No longer just the quiet janitor who fixed leaky faucets and changed light bulbs, but someone whose knowledge ran deeper than anyone had imagined. His explanation of the electrical system's problems was delivered in simple terms that made complex concepts accessible to everyone present. You see here, he said, pointing to a particularly confusing junction of wires, someone tried to make the old heart beat with new rhythm. But the heart remembers its own song. The metaphor resonated with the listening mechanics, who had spent careers thinking about cars as collections of parts rather than integrated systems with their own logic and history. Adnan stood at the edge of the group, his professional pride warring with growing respect for this unexpected expertise. The expensive diagnostic equipment sat silent and ignored, its sophisticated readouts suddenly seeming less important than the knowledge flowing from weathered hands and experienced eyes. Hassan's methodical approach revealed layer after layer of automotive archaeology. Each component he removed exposed evidence of different repair philosophies from different decades, creating a timeline of changing technology and varying skill levels. The young engineers found themselves learning principles that no university had taught them: how to read the history of a machine through the marks left by previous mechanics, how to understand the logic of repairs made during times when parts were scarce and creativity was essential. His commentary was delivered without condescension, but with the quiet authority of someone sharing hard-won knowledge. During the war, he said softly, we learned to make machines live when proper parts were impossible to find. Sometimes the old solutions are the only solutions that work. The workshop had become an impromptu classroom where practical wisdom was being passed from one generation to another. Even Amira, who had always prided herself on her theoretical knowledge, found herself taking mental notes about diagnostic approaches that no textbook had ever described. The distance between management and labor seemed to shrink as everyone focused on the mechanical puzzle that was slowly revealing its secrets. The transformation in workshop atmosphere became complete when Hassan began to demonstrate repair techniques that the young engineers had never encountered. His approach to wire splicing was precise and artistic, creating connections that were both mechanically sound and visually elegant. He worked without hurry, each movement deliberate and purposeful, like a surgeon performing a delicate operation. The tools in his hands seemed to become extensions of his will, responding to decades of muscle memory and accumulated skill. Marco watched in fascination as Hassan created custom solutions for problems that modern parts catalogs didn't address. "Where did you learn to do that?" the young engineer asked, his voice filled with genuine curiosity rather than challenge. Hassan paused in his work, his hands still holding the delicate components he was joining. "Before computers told us what was wrong," he replied simply, "we had to listen to what the machine was trying to say. Every sound, every vibration, every small sign, they all tell part of the story." His words carried the weight of an era when mechanical intuition was the primary diagnostic tool, and his demonstration was proving that such skills remained relevant even in the age of digital analysis. The shift in power dynamics became apparent as Adnan found himself asking questions rather than giving orders. His initial outrage had evolved through skepticism into reluctant admiration, and now approached something resembling respect. The expensive suit that had once marked his authority now seemed less important than the knowledge being demonstrated by a man in patched coveralls. "How long will the repair take?" Adnan asked, his tone noticeably different from the commanding voice he had used earlier. Hassan considered the question with the same methodical approach he applied to mechanical problems, his experienced eyes surveying the work that remained. "Good work cannot be rushed," he replied, echoing the patient philosophy that had guided his entire career. "Better to do it right once than to do it wrong many times." The proverb hung in the air like wisdom from an older world, and even the young engineers nodded their understanding. The workshop had become a place where time moved differently, where the pressure to show quick results gave way to the deeper satisfaction of solving problems correctly. Outside, the winter afternoon was fading into evening, and the snow continued to fall on a city that was learning to value different kinds of expertise. As Hassan continued his meticulous repair work, the expensive diagnostic equipment stood silent like monuments to a failed approach. The computers that had cost more than most people's annual salaries remained untouched, while an elderly janitor accomplished what they could not. His progress was visible and tangible. Each repaired connection brought the electrical system closer to its original design. Each replaced component restored a piece of automotive history. The young engineers found themselves studying his techniques with the intensity of apprentices learning from a master craftsman. Amira took photographs of his wire routing patterns, while Marco sketched diagrams of the repair sequences. Even the other workshop mechanics had abandoned their own projects to observe this unexpected masterclass in automotive restoration. The hierarchy that had defined the workplace for years was dissolving under the influence of demonstrated competence and quiet authority. Adnan's expensive education and management credentials seemed less relevant than Hassan's decades of hands-on experience with exactly this type of problem. The workshop had become a place where skill mattered more than status, where knowledge was respected regardless of its source. The revelation of Hassan's true expertise continued to unfold like chapters in a book that everyone had misjudged by its cover. As he worked, fragments of his professional history emerged through casual comments and demonstrated techniques. References to specific car models from decades past, mentions of repair challenges that predated modern solutions, and a familiarity with European automotive systems that suggested extensive experience with exactly these types of vehicles. The young engineers began to realize that they had been working alongside someone whose knowledge complemented their theoretical education in ways they had never recognized. His understanding of mechanical systems was intuitive and holistic, approaching problems from angles that computer diagnostics never considered. "You must think like the machine thinks," he explained, while adjusting a particularly stubborn component. "Every car has its own personality, its own way of telling you what it needs." This anthropomorphic approach to mechanical repair was foreign to engineers trained on standardized procedures and diagnostic protocols, but its effectiveness was becoming undeniable as the Volkswagen's electrical system began to respond to his patient ministrations. The workshop's transformation extended beyond technical admiration to a deeper recognition of overlooked human potential. Conversations that had once revolved around computer readouts and engineering theories now focused on practical wisdom and accumulated experience. Hassan's quiet confidence had infected the entire team, creating an atmosphere of collaborative learning that transcended traditional workplace boundaries. Even Adnan found himself contributing to discussions rather than simply directing them, his management authority evolving into something more like partnership. The expensive equipment remained available but unused, its sophisticated capabilities suddenly seeming less important than the human insight that was solving the problem through direct engagement and patient analysis. The workshop had become a laboratory where different approaches to knowledge were being tested and evaluated, and the results were reshaping everyone's understanding of what constituted real expertise. The snow continued to fall outside, but inside the building a different kind of transformation was taking place, one that would change how these people viewed both machinery and each other long after the Volkswagen was running again. The final moment arrived like dawn breaking over Mount Trebovich, quiet but transformative. Hassan made his last connection with the careful precision of a watchmaker, his weathered hands steady despite the weight of expectation that filled the workshop. Every person present held their breath as he closed the hood with a soft click that echoed through the silence. The Volkswagen sat before them like a patient emerging from surgery, its blue paint somehow seeming brighter under the fluorescent lights. Hassan wiped his hands on a clean rag, his movements unhurried despite the tension that crackled through the air like electricity. He approached the driver's door with the same reverence he had shown throughout the repair process, his fingers touching the handle as if greeting an old friend. The key turned smoothly in the ignition, and for a heartbeat, the workshop existed in perfect silence. Then the engine coughed once, twice, and suddenly roared to life with a sound that was both triumphant and inevitable. The Volkswagen's heartbeat filled the garage with mechanical music that spoke of restored life and vindicated faith. Tears formed in more than one pair of eyes as the impossible became reality. The workshop erupted in spontaneous applause that began with Marco and spread like wildfire through every person present. Amira laughed with pure joy while the other mechanics cheered and whistled their approval. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space, a celebration that seemed to shake the very walls of the building. Hassan sat behind the wheel, his face calm, but his eyes bright with quiet satisfaction as the engine purred with the smooth rhythm of perfect mechanical harmony. He revved the motor gently, and the response was immediate and eager, like a living creature stretching after a long sleep. The expensive diagnostic equipment remained silent and ignored, its sophisticated displays showing nothing, while the real solution idled peacefully before them. Even the harsh fluorescent lighting seemed warmer now, illuminated by the glow of achievement and the restoration of respect. Outside, the snow continued to fall on Sarajevo, but inside the workshop, winter had given way to spring. The young engineers gathered around the car like children around a Christmas tree, their faces glowing with wonder and newfound humility. This moment would be remembered long after the Volkswagen left for Mostar, a lesson in the power of experience and the danger of dismissing wisdom based on appearances. Adnan stood frozen in the aftermath of revelation, his expensive suit suddenly feeling like a costume that no longer fit. The applause continued around him, but all he could hear was the echo of his own words. "My best engineers couldn't do it, and you think you can?" The phrase repeated in his mind like an accusation, each repetition highlighting his arrogance and blindness. Slowly, with steps that felt heavier than lead, he approached the still-running Volkswagen where Hassan sat with quiet dignity. The old man's eyes met his through the windshield, and Adnan saw no anger, no triumph, no desire for revenge, only the same patient wisdom that had always been there, waiting to be recognized. "Hassan," he said, his voice barely audible above the engine's gentle rumble. The name felt different in his mouth now, weighted with respect rather than dismissal. "I owe you an apology." The words came slowly, each one a step away from the man he had been and toward the man he needed to become. "I was wrong about you. I was wrong about everything." His voice cracked with emotion as 20 years of overlooked brilliance became visible in a single moment of mechanical perfection. The workshop fell silent, except for the Volkswagen's steady heartbeat, everyone understanding that they were witnessing something far more significant than a successful repair. The transformation that followed was as complete as it was unexpected. Adnan extended his hand to Hassan through the car window, and when their palms met, it was more than a handshake. It was an acknowledgement of equal worth between two professionals who approached problems from different directions but shared the same dedication to excellence. "Would you consider becoming our senior consultant?" Adnan asked, his voice filled with genuine respect. "These young engineers could learn more from you in a month than I could teach them in a year." Hassan's response was characteristically modest. "Znanje se dijeli ne skriva." Knowledge is shared, not hidden. The old man turned off the engine and stepped out of the car with the same dignity he had shown throughout the ordeal. The workshop erupted in fresh applause, but this time it was different. Not just celebration of a successful repair, but recognition of a man whose worth had been hidden in plain sight for 2 decades. The young engineers surrounded Hassan with questions and requests for guidance, their textbook knowledge suddenly seeming incomplete without the practical wisdom he represented. Even the expensive diagnostic equipment seemed less impressive now, reduced to mere tools rather than the sophisticated solutions they had once appeared to be. The real solution had been walking among them all along, invisible until the moment when his quiet competence could no longer be ignored. As the celebration continued around the restored Volkswagen, Hassan quietly packed his simple tools with the same care he had shown throughout the repair. The workshop would never be the same, not just because of the successful restoration, but because everyone present had learned something fundamental about the nature of expertise and the danger of assumptions. The old janitor had become a teacher without seeking the role, his patient demonstration more powerful than any lecture about respect and recognition. Tomorrow, the Volkswagen would travel to Mostar, carrying with it the story of an elderly man whose worth was measured not by his title or his clothes, but by his ability to solve problems that defeated more celebrated minds. The snow outside had stopped falling, and through the workshop windows, the lights of Sarajevo twinkled like stars celebrating this small victory of wisdom over arrogance. Hassan looked around the transformed workplace one last time, his weathered face showing neither pride nor satisfaction, only the quiet contentment of someone who had done good work and been recognized for it. Por malo se daleko ide, he said softly to no one in particular. Little by little, one goes far. The words hung in the air like a blessing, a reminder that true achievement comes not from dramatic gestures, but from patient persistence and quiet competence. In the end, the greatest engine he had repaired was not made of metal and electricity, but of human understanding and mutual respect. If this story touched you or made you think, click the hype or like button and write in the comments what made the biggest impression on you. We want to hear your opinion. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Thank you and see you in the next story.